Now that the coercive acts were in play, it became obvious to most colonials, not just in Massachusetts, but all throughout, that there was going to have to be some sort of committee correspondence among all colonies, because if Massachusetts can be made into an example, any one of those colonies can be made into an example. That's what they all had in common. And they may have been different. They may have had their geographical differences, their colonial rivalries, New York and Virginia in particular. Um, but they were all under the same wrath of Parliament. And it became obvious they were going to need to get on the same page. So, again, unlike the Albany Plan before the onset of the French and Indian War, where you were going to have some colonial differences on display, now you're going to have some colonial similarities and reasons to unite. So it was deemed an issue for a Continental Congress in the fall of 1774 would be deemed as necessary and important. And a year later, or rather in the fall of 1774, the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. And they laid out these 5 plans. One major decision that they came under agreement was that they all rejected a plan for colonial union under British rule. Okay? Under British authority. They laid out some moderate grievances against King George, deeming him as most gracious sovereign, that may actually have been sarcastically noted under the guise of it being polite in recognition of our king. We know King George wasn't that way. Okay? It also included a repeal of all the oppressive legislation since 1763, beginning with whether it had been the Proclamation Line of 1763, the Declaratory Acts, the Stamp Act, the Coercive Acts, the Sugar Acts, the Townshend Duties, everything. All of those would now be repealed. They wanted to approve a series recommending military preparations for defense against British troops, regulars, if you will. As had been the case in Boston, some regulars fired upon colonials. We want an opportunity to maybe perhaps defend ourselves. They all agreed to various different boycotts of British-made goods. Okay, so you form a continental association that could enforce these as well. And then they also agreed later on to meet the following spring. So those 5 things right there were agreed upon at the First Continental Congress. You had people from different regions within British North America who actually came together. And they believed in this. Whereas 20 or so years before, in the Albany Plan, there was no such. But that war of the French and Indian War changed the entire dynamic. Yeah, Britain won, but it served to unify all colonies as well in the aftermath. That became huge. Now, many folks in Massachusetts felt that they would become targets should the British regular army come calling for justice or whatnot. Okay? The largest and angriest calls for dissent came from Massachusetts, Boston in particular. But all throughout Massachusetts, it would be deemed as necessary for there being a militia who could be ready on a moment's notice to defend Massachusetts. These men who could be ready on a moment's notice would be deemed as Minutemen. They could be ready in a minute, matter of minutes. Just go out there, grab a rifle, go out into the field, and defend. Okay? So you would have a militia, some citizen soldiers who would be out on the lookout and wait for aggressive moves by regular British troops, and especially in and around Boston, because we know that they're capable of it. Okay? It was there in Boston that General Thomas Gage, the commander of the regional British regular army garrison, um, he wanted to seek out some Americans who were the most vocal and make examples out of them. Like Sam Adams, for example. John Hancock was a wealthy merchant there in Boston. He wanted to make examples out of them as they had been known to be rebel leaders. We're going to go arrest them. Okay, that was the idea. However, he had heard that many of these militia Minutemen had been storing ammunition elsewhere out in the country a few miles away. He set out to go find it. And it was then around that time that the colonials set up kind of a watch. They would have a couple people identify where British regular troops were at any different time, and they would ride from different parts of town or maybe to neighboring towns to warn the towns that the regulars were coming. Okay? So, General Gage set out to go find these weaponry, hoping to surprise these rebellious colonials without there being any bloodshed. But Paul Revere, one in particular, one night in 1775, had identified British regular troops moving on to the town of Lexington outside of Boston. And that's where Paul Revere makes his famous ride. Now, often in history, it is erroneously stated that Paul Revere warned the locals that the British were coming. He wouldn't have said the British were coming. Paul Revere, in making his infamous ride, would not have said that, because at the time they were considered British subjects. He wouldn't have said the British are coming. Now, they did wear these bright red coats as part of their official uniform, so he may have said redcoats, but in reality, he would have referred to them as regulars. The regulars are coming, in a sense that British regular army troops, official troops of Britain, are coming. The regulars are coming. And in doing so, that alerted various different Minutemen outside of Lexington, Massachusetts, and rebel leaders actually skirmished with regular troops. Moving on to Concord, same thing. British regulars moving on from the next village were basically chased and shot at by farmers, kind of like guerrilla fashion, sniped at. And even though in that first pitch in Lexington, you had a couple dozen militiamen and Minutemen actually killed by regular troops in skirmishes, more harm was actually done to regular troops by harassing fire from random snipers out in the field, taking pot shots at regular troops. More regulars were killed than militiamen by far. So what in reality happened was you now have an armed conflict in colonial North America, centered around the Boston area. And in world history, the shot heard round the world as deemed to describe the incident that began the American Revolution had now been on display. Who shot first? Well, that was argued at the time. And to this day, it could be argued by historians. Some argued that unruly militiamen caught some regulars by surprise and shot fire, and the regulars were just defending. Others deemed it as necessary that the regulars actually shot first because they saw militiamen with ammunition and fired shots. Well, whichever story is true, what became true was that the militia Minutemen actually got the story out faster. So it became our truth that the regulars fired first. Nonetheless, the shot heard round the world had now come into play. What was about to begin now would be something that would truly change the world in grand scale, because you are now about to embark on America's revolutionary moment. All of these colonies in North and South America are going to follow suit in the coming decades. And then, not only that, the whole world is going to see, oh boy, what's going on with Britain's colony over there? Huh. France. What are they doing over there in America? um, Something major is about to happen in world history, and it's going to change the course of the world, and it affects us to this day, but it started with that one shot. Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to embark on America's revolutionary moment.